What if the simple act of clicking I agree created a legally binding contract? Hi, I'm Bethany Aline Errickson, a digital marketing master's student and music business valedictorian of Full Sail University. Today, I will evaluate the enforceability of Priceline.com's terms of use, specifically sections A through F. Terms of use are more than informational website policies. Terms of use establishes legal relationships between an online business and its users by defining each party's contractual rights, obligations, limitations of liability, dispute resolution procedures, and acceptable use requirements. As electronic commerce has expanded, courts has increasingly relied on traditional principles of contract law to determine whether online agreements are legally enforceable. The primary issue addressed in this evaluation are whether Priceline's term of use constitutes a valid contract, whether visitors are legally bound without affirmatively accepting the agreement, whether customers retain the right to sue Priceline in court, and what revisions could improve both enforceability and customer fairness. Rather than simply describing the agreement, this presentation evaluates its legal sufficiency using established contract law principles and judicial precedent. The first question is whether Priceline's term of use constitutes a valid contract. Generally, a legal enforceable contract requires 5 essential elements: offer, acceptance, consideration, capacity, and mutual assent. Online contracts are evaluated under the same principle, even though they are presented electronically rather than on paper. Priceline's term of use clearly identify the services offered through its website and mobile applications while establishing the conditions under which customers may access those services. The agreement explains users' responsibilities, limitations on liability, governing law, dispute resolution procedures, intellectual property rights, and acceptable use requirements. In exchange for access to Priceline's booking platform and travel related services, users agree to comply with those contractual terms. This exchange of promises generally satisfies the consideration requirements necessary to create a binding contract. However, the strongest legal issue is not consideration or capacity. Instead, it concerns mutual assent, often referred to as the meeting of the minds. The courts consistently hold that parties cannot be bound to contractual provisions unless they receive reasonable notice of the terms and demonstrate objective assent to them. This distinction is especially important in electronic commerce because courts recognize several forms of online agreements. A clickwrap agreement requires users to affirmly select an I agree button before completing a transaction. By contrast, browsewrap agreements merely post the term of use through a hyperlink and attempt to blind users based solely on their constituted use of the website. Courts generally enforce clickwrap agreements because affirmative acceptance provides objective evidence of assent, whereas browsewrap agreements receive significantly greater judicial scrutiny because users may never actually see the terms before completing a transaction. The Electronic Frontier Foundation likewise notes that enforceability depends largely upon whether customers receive responsibility notice and meaningful opportunity to review the agreement before becoming bound. The next issue is whether visitors are legally bound by Priceline's term of use without affirmatively selecting an I agree button. Although Priceline's agreement contains the essential element of a valid contract, enforceability depends on whether users receive reasonable notice of the agreement and objectively manifest their assent before becoming bound. Courts have consistently distinguished browsewrap agreements from clickwrap agreements because browsewrap agreements often rely solely on continued website use, whereas clickwrap agreements require affirmative acceptance. Since affirmative consent provides stronger evidence of mutual assent, requiring users to acknowledge the term of use before completing a transaction would strengthen Priceline's ability to enforce its agreement. The Electronic Frontier Foundation likewise emphasizes that users should receive meaningful notice and an opportunity to review online agreements before becoming bound. Priceline's term of use substantially limits how legal disputes may be resolved. Most disputes are subject to mandatory binding arbitration rather than traditional litigation, and users generally agree to pursue claims only on an individual basis instead of participating in a class action. Although certain claims may still proceed in small claims court or when arbitration is legally unavailable, customers who accept the agreement significantly limit their ability to pursue disputes through a traditional court system. These provisions are commonly enforced when users receive adequate notice and validity assent to the agreement. Several provisions would strengthen both enforceability and customer fairness. First, Priceline should require users to affirmatively accept the terms of use before completing a booking rather than relying primarily on constructive notice, as affirmative assent provides more stronger evidence of contractual acceptance. Secondly, important provisions such as arbitration, class action waivers, and limitations of liability should be displayed more conspicuously to improve the customer's awareness of significant contractual obligations. Finally, Priceline should provide advance notice of significant amendments rather than relying solely on posting revised online terms, an approach that has been criticized because unilateral modification provisions may undermine enforceability. These revisions would improve transparency while reducing future disputes regarding contractual assent and enforceability. The preceding analysis demonstrates that Priceline's term of use satisfy the fundamental requirements necessary to form a valid contract. The agreement establishes the legal rights and obligations of both Priceline and its users while incorporating contractual provisions commonly found in online customer agreements, including limitations on liability and dispute resolution procedures. Nevertheless, enforceability ultimately depends on whether Priceline can demonstrate that users received sufficient notice of the agreement and objectively manifested their acceptance before completing a transaction. Although the agreement provides significant legal protections through mandatory arbitration and related contractual provisions, Priceline could further strengthen enforceability by requiring affirmative acceptance before completing a booking. Improving the visibility of important contractual terms would also promote greater customer fairness. Overall, Priceline's term of use reflect established principles of online contract law while illustrating continuing importance of reasonable notice, informed consent, and transparency in electronic contracting.